So today's presentation is going to be about time travel, which, as we've just done for a couple of seconds, we're traveling in time even as we're talking right now. So definitely great practice for this presentation. So we'll get started. So first off, I'm Hannibal Brooks, and I'm an insight associate at Olson Zaltman. So we're a consumer insights firm founded by Jerry Olson of Penn State University and Gerald Zaltman of Harvard Business School. And we help clients understand the mind of the market by exploring how the unconscious, which are the factors deep in our minds that we're often not aware of, affect our decision making. So to start off, before we dive into time travel, I just wanted to tell you guys, I had a great day last week. My kids respected me. My boss promoted me. Everyone thought I was smart and attractive. Then I ran out of credits to continue the simulation. I'm just kidding. That's a time travel joke, but I figured I'd throw that in to kick things off. Anyway, thank you for joining me today. So as I'm talking to you right now, we're traveling forward in time, and the products of tomorrow are being created. So the hyper-personalized foods, the AI assistants, genetic testing, and more. And companies are placing their hopes in the idea that people will buy them. So in order to make sure that marketing and market research dollars are hitting the targets they're supposed to, it's critical we understand what factors determine the adoption of cutting-edge products. And for that, we can learn from the past. So today I invite you to join me on a trip back in time. Before we get started, it's important we acknowledge what to many of us seems like an obvious fact. Why create anything new? And the answer is that people like new things. The Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman posits that we process experiences through three distinct psychological impulses: anticipation, experience, and memory. Anticipation is the excitement built around an imagined future experience, and it's the highest in the case of a familiar behavior, like getting your favorite meal at a restaurant. It's potent because those neural pathways are already primed for that pleasurable experience, but no new memories will be formed since those consumption occasions start to blur together and become indistinct. So you can probably think of, the time your favorite, Chinese buffet, your fast food, or high-end French dining. And the experience may have been great, but after you go there a couple of times, the individual occasions start to become less memorable. So new products exist in the nexus between experience and memory. So anticipation is minimal because the brain can't prepare for the outcome of something it hasn't experienced yet. But new products have the potential to create new memories. And with them, they can create habits that prove profitable or do social good. Fortunately, we're past the days of having fruits and vegetables and everything embedded in gelatin, but definitely cutting edge at the time. But the challenge is, even though people like new products, they naturally avoid risk. So the RiskSociety Hypothesis, which was developed by leading sociologists Beck and Giddens in the late 80s, it found that risk is targeted at some social experience, but not others. So the more complex the system, the more salient the fear, especially if those systems harvest energy from volatile sources. So while it's possible you could choke on the spork with your next fast food meal, you're probably a lot more worried about the car you're operating in the drive-thru. And this instinct is often wrong. People are probably more terrified of the risk around roller coasters than sinks, even though sinks kill 25 times more people annually in the US alone. So if we think about something like air travel, which many of us use on a regular basis and 8 million people are using every day, it begs the question, how was anyone ever convinced this was safe? The average flight is 30,000 feet above ground. The engine has the power of 28 Formula One cars, and the plane is built out of over 1.2 million parts. So with that in mind, let me take you back to the early 1930s, when commercial air travel was just leaving the runway. So in the early 1930s, airlines faced a problem. People thought flight was fascinating, but they viewed it as a risky barnstorming adventure. And this made selling it tough because airlines wanted simple business and leisure travel. Meanwhile, the public was fixated on stunt pilots, major crashes, and accidents. So for it's great for the appeal, but it was something that made it very frightening for the average consumer. You're not going to get a lot of adventure on your flight from Racine to Tampa, but you're also not going to face a lot of risk, which is a good thing. So marketers from several airlines teamed up to enact a solution. First, they realized they couldn't ignore customer concerns, but they could subvert them using empathy. So if you look at the ad on this screen here, you'll see that airlines use ads showing relaxed families, cheery businessmen, and playful kids. And this was no accident. They are actually a little bit ahead of the curve. A 2011 research paper, Emotion and Perception, the Role of Effective Information, found that simply viewing a frightened face versus a neutral one heightened subjects' ability to distinguish between different contrasts of color and other environmental cues. So empathy actually changes how we pay attention. In this case, boring and happy was better. Importantly, they also made an agreement on what subtle visual indicators of danger to avoid. So if you look at any airline ads from the 1920s to the 1950s, they made a studious effort to avoid mountains, nighttime flying, large bodies of water, and especially airplane maintenance. So anything suggesting that air travel was unsafe. Obviously, they couldn't scream, "This airplane is crash-proof," but they also needed a method to address concerns about safety. So the RiskSociety hypothesis, if you'll remember, it showed that people fear complex systems. So they simplified by showing diagrams of planes that highlighted the latest safety features. This seems a little counterintuitive because you think, okay, if people fear complexity, why would you show a diagram of a very complex system? And for that, research kind of provides an answer. So a Journal of Consumer Psychology paper, Promoting Consumer Adoption of High Technology Products, Is More Information Always Better? That paper found that information is worse when both a system and an interface are new, compared to when just an interface is new. So if we think about something like the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 8, the same system, new interface. Let's say, if they say we're adding a new software update, people aren't going to lose their minds and become concerned. But if someone said the iPhone 9 is going to be embedded in your brain, people would be far more concerned because then the interface and the system are changing. So you'll notice that marketers circumvented this by comparing the plane to familiar modes of transport, like the car, the ship, and the train. So providing more information ultimately didn't hurt them. If you compare it to this complicated medicine ad on the right, you can see that information overload can provoke a lot more fear and anxiety about using a new product. But even though they'd solved some of the problems around fear, they had another problem: women. So market research at the time showed that 2/3 of those who prohibited other people from flying were women. And that's because they were concerned about the safety of their significant others and their children while flying. Ultimately, in airline industry circles, they became known as airline enemy number one, which a little juvenile, but it was the 1930s. A lot of things have changed. So Madison Avenue agencies realized they could succeed by making the customers' concerns about family their own. So they created programs that allowed husbands to bring their wives on free flights, and they rolled out ads emphasizing how air travel could save time for family trips, allow more productive work days, and ultimately lead to monetary benefits at home. So it worked, and women went from being 15% of flyers to nearly 40% in just a couple of years. And again, this is another case in which the marketers were ahead of the curve. So word of mouth was shown in a 2019 research study on influencer marketing to be especially helpful for risky, complex, and innovative products. So by allowing women to have trial of this product, they were able to spread the word and ultimately reduce fears due to some social norming effects as well. Next, we're going to travel back in time again, this time to the 1910s, when the telephone first hit the mass market. So if you can put yourself in the mindset of someone at the turn of the century, the telephone was actually a really magical device because you're getting real-time communication from a disembodied voice. So it's a really frightening, magical, and kind of exciting feeling. But that magical nature ultimately left room for misinterpretation. So when the telephone came out, the response was harsh for a couple of different reasons. So on one side, you had issues coming from the complexity side of the RiskSociety hypothesis. So in this case, there was a strong group of preachers that warned that phones were implements of the devil. There was a popular book at the time called Are the Dead Alive that suggested ghosts could speak with you and take possession of you through telephone lines. And so this actually led to a number of telephone lines being sabotaged and stolen and destroyed. So big risk, number one, for the telephone there. You know that crackling sound you hear on the line when you're waiting for a call to connect? Major newspaper columns warn that you could lose hearing in your right ear from extended use. So you can see that on the column on your right there. And that was another strike against the early adoption of the phone. Now, if these concerns about your health and your spiritual safety weren't enough, the telephone got dealt a third blow because heavy arguments were made that they would promote incivility on a massive scale. The verdict's still out on cell phones, but this is a leading quote from the 1907 New York Times. So pretty dangerous stuff. So much like the airline teams before, telecom teams realized that they had to innovate, and they used some of the same elements that airlines did. So they had a few big obstacles in getting the phone out there, and their challenges can sort of be examined through two more factors in consumer behavior toward new products. And those factors are relative advantage and perceived risk. So relative advantage is how much of an improvement a product is over what's out there. So research shows that the higher consumers perceive the relative advantage of an innovation over existing methods, the more encouraged they are to purchase it. So in the 1920s, the length of the average telegram was about 10.33 words. So people had to be pretty brief. That's about as many words as you could say in 5 seconds on the phone, which in the phone, 1 minute, you could get about 120 words out. So telephones had a big factor in their favor if they could convince people to try them out. Now, the second factor they faced was perceived risk. And perceived risk is how much is at stake when you switch to a new product. So if we think about something like electronic ticket ordering and online banking, they were both innovations when they came out, but one is far easier for consumers to adopt. If you think about the risk of losing a concert ticket versus losing all your money. So if people using the phone felt like they were risking their immortal souls, their hearing, or the breakdown of public society, they definitely wouldn't use the phone. So telecom companies simplified by creating, they created ads that eliminated the mystery by simplifying. So they overrode these risks. If you look here, much like with airlines, they presented detailed diagrams of their product with illustrations of its huge advantages for commerce, for politics, for innovation. And this had the effect of completely eliminating two perceived risk, occult possession and bodily harm. And it also underscored the relative advantage of the phone over competitors. They also used a third tactic, which is kind of what we specialize in at OZ, and that is metaphor. So ads were developed emphasizing the communal nature of the phone. So on the left, there's a metaphor comparing a party line, which most early phone lines were, to a barn raising, or as a tool to reach distant relatives. So on one hand, you're getting this aspect of social proof, which is a key element of persuading people to try new products. And metaphor really does matter here because most early lines were party lines. So if you're on a phone call, you're often hearing your neighbor's phone call, you have to coordinate and work together. So here they made it like a positive thing. It's like building a barn. It's like something that you create once and it helps the entire community. Or you're using it as a tool to reach out to a distant relative and emphasizing this role of connection. So this campaign ended up being a massive success. And in 10 years, telephones went from being in only 20% of households to nearly 60% within a decade. So by using these subtle factors, they were able to hugely increase adoption of the phone. For the last step in our journey, which if you've noticed, it's been about 15 minutes, we've already moved about 50 years. We're going to go back in time even further to the late 1800s. Now this time we're going to be looking at a novel invention arguably created by nature itself, and that's ice. Nature can create products, but it definitely benefits from some help in the marketing department. And so for that, here's the story. So ice in the early 1800s was primarily used by farmers in the northeastern US as a way to keep butter from melting on the way to market. But that was basically it as far as food use went. So a New Englander named Frederic Tudor traveled to the Caribbean, And he realized that ice could have enormous potential there and in other warm areas. So 100 years before the refrigerator, he figured out that sawdust could keep ice insulated for a long time, even years. So he harvested ice from Massachusetts lakes, and the diagram on the left sort of shows people harvesting ice from the lakes using hand saws. If any of you have seen Frozen, that's what's happening in the beginning there. Surprisingly accurate. And so he harvested ice from Massachusetts lakes, and he sent it on a journey of months, starting with a shipment of 130 tons of ice to Martinique. And so his plan was to get there and make an enormous fortune when he delivered the ice to people who'd never seen it before. But when he got there, it was actually a colossal failure. So nearly all of it melted. And that's not because his storage system didn't work, but because people were confused about it. I mean, if you can think about it, it's a place where people had never seen ice before. So they would wrap it up in blankets and take it home and wonder why it had melted. And at the time, the concept of ice in drinks was essentially unheard of. So Tudor actually went bankrupt on that trip. He was undeterred, so he started planning on how he was going to sell ice again while he was bankrupt in debtor's prison. Once he got out, he crisscrossed the Caribbean and the US South, and he tried a different tactic this time. He offered ice for free at bars to convince people of its relative advantage. So he would give bartenders ice and challenge them to offer their drinks at the same price with and without ice to see which one was most popular. Of course, once people had tried drinks with ice, there was no going back because it really was an incredible experience for them. He also held workshops where he brought ice to doctors and had clinics showing them how to use it on feverish patients. And then he held teaching workshops at restaurants and hotels showing them how to make ice cream. So once people had tried ice, they were excited and they weren't ready to go back to warm drinks, mediocre medical treatment, and less interesting desserts. So what Tudor had actually done was gamify the ice experience. Research shows that gamification enhances adoption of innovative products by increasing playfulness and curiosity, hence the relaxing bar setting. And that also increases perception of relative advantage because as customers use a product, its attributes become more vivid and therefore its applications become more clear. So playfulness helps customers become more willing to give products a chance, while triggering curiosity allows them to think of new applications for it in their daily lives. So ultimately, Tudor ended up a massive success. He died with millions to his name. He went by a nickname, the Ice King, that was given to him by all the people he benefited, and global fame. So by 1860, hundreds of tons of ice were shipped around the world by the US. And the only thing we shipped more of than ice at that time was cotton. In 1862, this book was published called The Bartender's Guide. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the bedrock of our modern drinking culture. And in it, nearly every drink recipe called for ice. So now that we've traveled through 3 various decades, what are the lessons for the innovations of tomorrow? The edible furniture, the 5G-enabled miniature TVs, the instant genetic modification kits of the future. Well, here are the big takeaways. The first is simplifying your idea, making sure customers understand they know how a product works, at least at a basic level, because you don't want to overwhelm them with information, but you want to get it across clearly. The second is to reduce the risk. If people know that a product won't harm or fail them, they're far more encouraged to take a chance on it. Third is to highlight the advantage. People want to know that this product will make their life easier, and you want to find subtle ways to communicate this fact. The fourth is gamification. If you can make a product experience or advertising more fun, people will have fun with it and find ways to make it applicable to their lives. And the fifth is to demonstrate social proof. If you can show that, like with a telephone, the product connects them, or it ties back into that sodium word of mouth, it shows that others can use it in their lives, and ultimately consumers will find a way for it to make sense in their life. So metaphor is one of the most powerful ways to communicate all of these concepts in a simple form. So instead of listing safety features, you can show that this product is keeping a family safe, or happy, or having fun with each other. Words can only go so far because language will change as we move forward in time, but metaphor is universal and timeless. And so that's what our focus is really on at Olson Zaltman. I know this has been a very brief journey through time, but consider this back to the future light. So with that said, I'm going to show you guys a couple of ads from the past and leave the room open for some questions if you have any. And I'll say again, if you look at these ads surrounding this, they're definitely some of the more fun ads from the they're stemming, I think, from the late 60s all the way to the early 70s. So maybe you can challenge yourself and see a couple of metaphors in these ads here. Okay, first question in. So first question is, do you have any thoughts on products or services today that are good products but are scary and could use some of the advice that I provided today? So products and services that are good but scary. I think there's definitely a lot of this in consumer resistance to medical treatments. So if I had to think of one, actually, this is probably a challenging, maybe even controversial one, but let's say genetic modification of foods. So if you think about something taking place like climate change, resiliency in foods is going to be important, but there's also this push to increase labeling. I think what you might think about in foods that use genetically modified crops, because if crops are going to survive, it's going to have to be in a lot more foods. What's a way we could effectively leverage that using metaphor? I think companies that produce foods that use genetically modified ingredients might have to, like if you think about with telephones or airlines, assemble on a bigger industry-wide basis and think about a messaging campaign centered around the benefits of genetic modification, maybe comparing it to other naturalistic processes, right? If you think about something like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, many people think it's like the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis and then grows wings. But what actually happens is the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, it entirely dissolves, its genes shift around a little bit, and then the butterfly is born as a new creature from those same original ingredients. So maybe if there is something that emphasized the natural process, and if there was an ad campaign centered around other transformative, natural, and positive processes, we could start, maybe the public opinion on that could shift a little bit. And I think I'm just referencing foods and some of these other things because my background is in food science, but I think anything could work. Okay, now here's one more challenging one from the audience. Is there a way to turn around anti-vax people? Or are those fears just too deeply rooted given today's sort of fact-free news climate? Wow, okay, that's definitely a hard ball. I think even, not to give any cover to anti-vax supporters, but I think a lot of concerns in that arena are born out of, much like the women, if you look at the airline industry, a lot of those concerns are born out of love and concern for the safety of their family and loved ones. So obviously vaccines are designed to help people live longer and to extend the quality of their lives. But there's the way they're marketed often. I think vaccines have almost become like you enter and it's just something that's expected, and we emphasize the health benefits, but not necessarily the benefits it has to family and life. So I don't know if I've seen many vaccine ads that focus on the benefits it has for families. You're getting to spend more time with your kids. You're getting to spend more time with your older relatives that are living longer as, some other diseases become concerning in later life. So maybe if there was a campaign that centered around allowing families and the benefits of connection of vaccines, there might be something there. Okay, new question in. What do you think will be the next huge innovation that will be successful because marketers are leveraging these insights? Now, this is a very interesting question. One that's top of mind for me right now, even if it's probably a little further off, is this idea called the neural net. And so the neural net is this idea that, as we develop AI that reaches knowledge that's at the level of humans. Think of something like your Siri or Alexa ultimately becoming as smart as another person. Humans are going to need the ability to search online and do a whole range of other activities using technology that's synced up or potentially embedded in their minds. And so do I think that? I think that's a big innovation I'm thinking of, and that will, when it happens, be transformational to our entire, the way we operate in the world. So if the metaphor is definitely going to be a strong and necessary force in making something like that happen. Again, I'm throwing the ball forward probably a few decades, but I think that'll be a really interesting one to watch, along with things like self-driving cars. Now a new question. Is virtual reality an example of a product hobbled by a low perceived relative advantage? And how can this be addressed? Well, that's a great question. I do think that virtual reality has definitely been kept within the bounds of what's possible now. People don't, I think they're not really aware of, or there's not a big public awareness of how much what its relative advantage is, how that can be addressed. I think right now the current wave of VR ads, I'm thinking of a couple. I think there's the Oculus Rift, and then I think there's a lower tier Oculus product that has recently been launched by Facebook, and then the HTC Vive. A lot of ads are focused on the experiential, so feeling like you're at a boxing match, or like you're in some area in nature and observing it. And I think maybe if the focus is kind of shifted from, maybe it should be about embedding people in events that are more tangible but distant versus something that's entirely creative or impossible. So that is going to be a tough one, but maybe if it's merged with some technologies like there's like virtual, like web teleconferencing software. Maybe people can see the benefits of it for something in their daily lives that'll ultimately hammer home its advantage. And we can extend from there to more entertaining and fantastical journeys. But right now, there's kind of a perception VR is for gaming and sort of immersive, imaginative experiences. So maybe if we can tilt that from that to something that's more tangible and people are using every day in advertising and messaging, ultimately we could increase adoption. So those are my thoughts there on virtual reality. Good question. Okay, a new question's in. In your work with innovative brands and products today, how many are able to check off the list of simplifying, gamifying, social proof, reducing risk? And have there been any memorable examples of products that only did one or two of these? So that is a great question. So I think right now we're in it's hard to think of them necessarily as products, but I think there's a great area to apply this in political messaging. So we're definitely in an age where simplification is going to be key, because policy proposals are definitely complex, but simplification is important. Reducing risk is important. I know I don't want to wade into too many politically charged waters here, but I think the world as a whole faces a lot of threats as a factor of whether they're military, whether they're political, and a lot of changes from an economic perspective. And as technology is being adopted, those are changing. So I think I watched some policy debates relatively recently, and I think there's definitely a big focus on simplifying, reducing risk. And if you think about the stories that people tell about meeting constituents one-on-one, there's a lot of the social proof. I think the gamification element is probably a little bit different. If we move to a different sector, I think with foods, I was at the IIEX very recently, and one of the more fascinating presentations there was about how food companies could work well with gamers. And that was developing foods that are the perfect mix of like not being too distracting or powdery or whatever when someone is playing a video game, so they can pop something in, enjoy it, and then keep going. So I think that's more of a mixture of simplifying. They had ads emphasizing social proof and gamification to an extent, which is kind of funny because it was directly linked with gaming. So another product, Opower, which was bought by Oracle, it sort of gamified power conservation. If you think about something like Nest, you're controlling your thermostat from your phone, And I've done some work recently with people using technology, and a lot of conversation around Nest thermostats talked about how it's fun because the whole family can sort of use and change their power usage. And it was about getting people to adopt a new behavior versus a product, but definitely in that same space of gamification. I guess I'll wait to see if there are any more questions. All right, well, if not, we're at about 30 minutes. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today, and hopefully enjoy the rest of your journey through time as the day goes on.